There's an oil painting technique that's been used by the old masters for centuries, when they paint with a basic sepia underpainting first to lay a solid foundation for the painting, and then they add colors on top. You must have seen this technique before, it's used a lot. Today I'm going to try applying the same method to some of my digital speed paints here to see how this turns out, and show you how you can try it with your paintings too. So let's jump right in. Hello everybody, hope you're all doing great. If you don't know me, I'm Madhavan. I'm a concept artist and illustrator. I am running an art studio and creating content to share my journey and techniques and hopefully help aspiring artists. And if you do know me, you know that I am a huge Lord of the Rings fan, and so this first speed paint will be inspired by that. As you can see, I have started the speed paint with some initial sketching to know where the forms are. At this stage, I try to keep the sketches very loose. I don't need a ton of details in each one of these things. It should be enough to just give me a sense of composition and where everything would be placed. It makes things a lot easier because then I wouldn't need to figure this stuff out in the later stages of this painting. So for the scene, I am thinking of two huge statues at the edge of the river with large mountains in the background. And yeah, this scene is inspired by the Fellowship of the Ring, where the Fellowship is basically crossing a river and come across these huge statues. It's a pretty cool scene. So after the sketch is done, I've also started to add some grayscale values. I'll start with some midtones, and as the things go further into the background, I'll use a lighter value. So for the sky, I've used a much lighter value, and for the statues, some relatively darker grays. So that's usually the value distribution when you're painting a landscape. When things go further into the background, they lose three things. They lose detail, they lose value, and they lose color. So the stuff in the background will have much less contrast between the lights and the darks. Now for the reflections, I could have just copied the top part of the painting, flipped it vertically, and placed it within that river shape that I made. But let's do it the old school way and just paint it. My favorite part of the painting is adding highlights because it really refines the forms and helps you visualize these forms really clearly. The forms in your paintings are basically comprised of lights and shadows. So as you can see, I'm just using two tones to create a sense of forms in the mountains, a lighter tone and a darker tone. If you're an artist and if you use references, which you really should, then when you look at the references of, let's say, mountains or trees, you should just try simplifying them into light shapes and shadow shapes. And mostly there are very interesting shapes made by shadows, and it's the same for the highlighted areas as well. In these mountains you can see that there are some really interesting shapes for the highlights, which is really helping to visually communicate the complexity of the form. Some loose strokes for the clouds. I'm sure the old masters didn't have the luxury to tweak levels and curves, but here we are in Photoshop. Just because we are able to do it, we're gonna do it. So I've just used the curves to push the contrast a little further, make the darker areas feel a bit more dark. And then using a soft round brush with a light gray selected, I'm trying to push the statues further into the background in terms of value, so that they seem like they are at a distance. This also really helps with the scale and sell the idea that they are huge statues. There are two very effective ways to visually communicate a sense of scale. The first is, of course, the values, which I just discussed. So if something is huge and further into the distance, it would have much less contrast. The darks on that subject wouldn't look very dark. It would lose some color information as well. And mostly the visual details, especially in the shadows, they just disappear. And so in the distance, you'll be able to just see a big shadow shape and no detail in it whatsoever. So that really helps with the scale. The other very effective thing is to put a reference for scale. So when we see scale in a painting, it's usually relative. So if something appears big in a painting, it appears big because we can see something smaller in comparison. That is why most of the concept art pieces have a small scale dude. So if we put a small scale figure in front of these statues would naturally feel a lot bigger. And just imagine if we put a a large human figure in front of these statues wouldn't appear so big. So human eyes perceive scale relatively, and that's the exact reason why we put a small boat in the river, to register a sense of scale. Okay, now once we have the grayscale art completed, we can just add some color to it. Remember the sepia underpainting that I talked about? We'll try to do this in a similar way. I think I forgot to record some parts of the Speedpaint, but here's exactly what I did. I just added all the layers into a group, made a copy of that group, turned that group into a single layer, and then applied a gradient map. To apply a gradient map, you just go to Image, Adjustments, Gradient Map. I have a whole video on it if you want to check it out. So the gradient map helps build a very rough sense of color in the painting. So I chose yellow for the highlights and blue for the shadows. Now this looks pretty similar to what a sepia underpainting would look like. I know this is more towards yellow and not an accurate tone of sepia, but you get the idea. Now it's time to add color. And I would not use an overlay or multiply or any of the blending modes for this one. I'm just going to select a color and add it on a separate layer on top of this. So for the sky, some blues, for the clouds, some whites, for the statues, some light browns, for the distant mountains, some darker blues, and some white for the snow. Some greens for the greener parts, of course. Now the beauty of this technique is that we can still see some of that underpainting tone. I'm filling up most of the areas with the colors, but I can still see the underlying tone of the underpainting, which is amazing. I think it's a really good technique. It really adds a lot of personality into the painting, and you could definitely try this technique out with your paintings as well. And I'm just going to try the same thing with some of my other speed paints as well, and I'll be sure to use a more accurate sepia tone in the next one as well. So make sure you check it out. I'll also be adding bits and pieces of useful information throughout the whole video. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the process. If you like these speed paints, you might also want to check out some of the other speed painting videos that I have on this channel. With that being said, I'll see you in another video. Take care. Bye bye.